Okay, so now we're going to look at how to test conditions within a for-in loop. So we're going to now combine if statements and for-in loops. So within the loop, we'll have an if statement, and basically we're going to use this to print out only certain elements of an array based on the results of test conditions. So up until this point, we've only looked at how to print out kind of every element of an array. Now we're going to look at a few different ways to print out only certain elements based on these test conditions. Alright, so now we're going to combine conditionals with for loops, or for-in loops. So this is going to add we're going to add if statements and for loops together, so that with each iteration of the loop, we're going to test some kind of condition and then maybe do some kind of work depending on the outcome of that condition. So I'm going to use a few examples. The first one is just going to be printing out only certain values of a loop depending on what the current value of index is. Okay, so I'm just going to create this quick array, and this is going to be cool. I'm just going to call this int array, feeling I'm creative today, and this is going to be an array of type int. I'm just going to initialize it to contain some values. It's just going to contain 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so it's 6 elements long. It's just the numbers 1 through 6. It's an int array. So what I'm going to do with this array is I'm going to iterate through each of these elements, and I'm only going to print out the odd ones. Okay, so I know for this array we know exactly what they are because we know it's 1 through 6, but what if this was an array with jumbled odd and even ones and we only want the odd ones? So, you know, let's say we had a different, more complicated array, and in fact I might as well do that so we have a more clear example. So let's just create some values and 90 or something. Okay, so some of these are even, some of these are odd. I'm only going to print out the even ones, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to also introduce what we call the modulus operator. So this is basically we take a number and let's say 5 mod 3, for example. Then we get 2. And basically what the modulus operator does is it divides the first number by the second number and returns the remainder. Okay, so the remainder, for those of you who can't really remember what a remainder is just basically whatever's left over after the division. Okay, so let's say we have 5 divided by 3. Well, 3 only goes evenly into 5 once, and then there's 2 as a remainder, or else there's, you get some kind of a decimal number. If we did like 6 mod 3, however, we should get 0, because 3 divides evenly into 6 twice, and there's no remainder. Whereas if we had 4 mod 3, it should be a 1. And what do we get printed? We're just going to let it run. And it's being very slow, but it should be a 1. There we go. So we see that 1 printed out. Okay, so this is what the modulus operator does. It just returns the remainder. Now, the modulus operator comes in very handy if we're testing for odd and even. So basically, we can say if for mod, well, let's say if our number mod whatever is 0, then we know it's even, and if our number mod 2 is 0, then we know it's even. If it's mod 2 and it returns a 1, then it's odd. So for example, if we have like 5 mod 2, it returns a 1, so we know it's odd. Whereas if we have like a 6 mod 2, then it returns a 0, so we know it's even, okay? So at any number mod 2 will basically tell us whether or not that number's even or odd, okay? So if it's a 0, then it's even. If it's mod 2, it's not a 0, it's a 1, then we know it's odd, okay? So that's how we're going to test to see whether these numbers are odd or even. So we're going to use our for-in loop. We're going to use index will start at 0 because, again, we're using an array. So it's in 0, and we're running until the array length. So this was int array dot, let's see, is there a length function? Nope. It's going to have to be count minus 1. Just going to put that in a bracket here. And remember, this is a good way to get the size of the array, or rather run until the last element of the array if you don't necessarily know the size. I could call, what's this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I could call 6, but this is just gives a more definite value, and again, if we don't know the size of the array, this is a better option to use. Okay, so we're just going to run this test. We're going to say if int array at the specified index mod 2 equals 1. So if it's odd, then we want to print it. Then print int array of the specified index. Okay? So basically this is just saying it will iterate through all of the elements in int array, and I'm just going to leave some spaces there so it brings it up a little bit. So yeah, it's going to iterate through all the elements in int array, and it's going to say, is the int array element at the specified index, if we mod it by 2, is it equal to 1? Well, if it is, then we want to print it. So basically, is that element odd? And if it is, we want to print it. So what it's going to do is it's going to start at int array of 0. So it's going to say, is this one odd? Yes, it is, so print it. The next one, is it odd? Yes, so print it. Third one, is it odd? Nope. Fourth one, is it odd? Nope. Fifth one, yes. Sixth one, yes. Seventh one, no. Okay? So this way, this is actually testing to see if the values themselves within the array are odd. And if they are, we print them. And as you can see at the bottom, we get 7, 5, 87, and 91 printed, because these are the odd elements in our array. All of the other elements in the array are even. They fail this test, and so we don't do anything with them. Okay? So we're only printing out the odd ones, and this is how you do it. So this is an example of a for-in loop that tests the specific value of each element of the array. Now, what if we just wanted to print out every other element of the array? Okay, so rather than printing out every array, which we would see if we did something like this, 0, comma, and then what was it? Int array dot count minus 1. And just putting this in brackets. I think the brackets are unnecessary, but just in case, you know, it helps to be safe. So if we want to print out all of the elements, we would just do something like this. Print int array. If I can type int array of index. Okay? So that's how we'd print out every element of the array. However, we only want every other element. So this is no longer running a test to test each specific element of the array. It's just testing the index of the array. Okay, so there's a difference between the two. One is looking at each value at the specified index and testing it. Now we're just testing the index. Okay, so we don't actually care about what value the index of the array contains. We don't care that this is a 7 and this is a 332. It doesn't really matter. We're just looking at the index number itself. Okay, so the way we want to do that is we want to say if index, let's say we want to print out every odd element, so kind of this is the element starting at 1, then 3, then 5, then 7, 9, etc. So if we would say if index mod 2 equals 1, then we want to print int array of the specified index. Okay, so again, testing to see if the index is even or not. So we're testing to see if it's odd here. If it's odd, then we'll print it out. If it's not, then we'll do nothing. Okay? All right. So basically, oh, I see. No wonder we're getting so many values printed out. I'm just going to comment out this first for loop. Okay, it made me think I was doing something wrong there for a second. Okay, so you see this? It runs 3 times, okay? So it's only running 3 times, and that's because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 elements. So we'll start at 0. Well, that's even, so we'll skip that. We'll start at 1 and print it. 2 will skip. 3 will print it. 4 will skip. 5 will print. 6 will skip. Okay, so if we just allow this to run, look at what we get printed out. We get 5, 54, and 91 being printed out here. Okay? So this is a way to, this is just printing out the odd elements. If we change this to a 0, then we get the even indexed elements printed out. Okay, so this is two ways to kind of think about how to access only certain elements of an array using a for in loop. So we looked at accessing elements using the value itself of the element. So we called the int array of the specified index and then looked at the value that the element contains. And then we looked just at the index itself, completely ignoring whatever value the int array at that index contains. We were only looking at the index number itself. Okay, so this is one way to test it. Another way to test it, we could print out only the first half of the array. So let's say we could say something like this. I'm just going to comment this one out too so we don't get a bunch of stuff printed. We could say something like this for index in 0 up to the int array dot count -1. Then we can do something like if index is less than 4, then print int array of index, and that will basically only print out the first 3 elements of our array, or in this case the first 4 elements, because we're starting at 0. Okay, so we get 75, 32, 54, and 75, 332, and 54. So perfect. So now I've showed you 3 different ways to access different elements of the array. Just to recap what we've learned so far, we started off with this integer array, contains a random mix of odd and even numbers. I just kind of thought of values and chucked them in. The first for loop printed values, or printed the specific values from this array based on their specific value. Okay, so we looked at each element within the array, we looked at its value and said if it's an odd number we're going to print it, if it's an even number we're not going to do anything. Okay, so this is how you access only the odd elements of this array. For this one, for the second for loop, we looked only at the index itself. So we didn't care what value the int array at that index contained. It could be odd, even, we don't really care. We're only printing out certain elements based on the value of index. So this is a way to access only certain elements of the array based on the index value. Okay, and then for our final loop, we only had the first half of the array printed out. If we wanted, we could have the second half by doing something like this. We could switch it around. So then we get only the last ones being printed out. And so that way we can access only kind of like half the array, or kind of ignore all of the elements up to a point and print all of the others, or do something like that. Okay, so I only really showed you how to print these, but you can do lots of other stuff. You can perform operations on them. I just want to show you how to access a few different ways to access only specific elements within the array using this for in loop rather than accessing every element, which we've seen up until now. Okay, so this is going to be the final part. The next part will just kind of be a recap of what we've fully learned so far. Okay, so in this part we tested conditions within a for loop using if statements. So we printed out values of an array using a couple of different ways to determine which elements to print out. So the first half, or rather the first third, kind of focused more on printing out elements based on their value. So we went into the array, within each iteration of the for loop, we went into the array, looked at the value that the array, or the value of the index of that array, see what it contains. And then we tested to see if it was odd, and we printed out only the odd elements. Okay, so this was a way to print out elements based on their specific value. Next, we looked at how to print out print out elements based on the value of the index. So this was a way to print out kind of only every other element of the array, regardless of what its value was. The final third was focused on printing out a certain part of the array, so a big block. We looked at printing out just the first half of the array, and then we looked at printing out the second half of the array based on what kind of value the index contained. Okay, so this was just a few different ways to print out only certain elements of the array rather than all of the elements based on tests of the index itself or the value that that element at that index contains.